Yep.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to present some of my research and interest, and I really have a conversation on the death of racialized men, specifically Black men in the West. For quite some time, I've been thinking about the ways that modern aesthetics, specifically Kant's notion of the beautiful and the sublime, interacted with the kind of horrors we saw or see in lynchings and contemporary police killings of Black men and racialized men around the world. So I say that to give a little bit of the interest behind this particular conversation. Beauty's in the mind of the oppressor, the Black male corpse as the vestibule to the sublime. Uh, now, for oops, my screen's not. Now, for many of us, we don't typically think of the corpse as a kind of aesthetics. But I think in reading and trying to grapple with some of the previous work done by John Abdul John Muhammad, we can really see that there's a real question in terms of how we view racialized men. So while we've made lots of distinctions between that which is beautiful and that which is sublime in the philosophy of aesthetics, we traditionally understand the deaths of human beings, murders, massacres, genocides, to be tragedies, horrors that are often too grotesque to be viewed for the public. But in the United States and other places throughout the West, this has not been the case for Black men. Throughout history, the Black male corpse has indicated the triumph of white civilization, white morality, and the protection of womanhood. So the dead Black male body was thought to be sublime, an example of a seemingly corporeal horror mutilation that conveys an eternal and transcendental truth. The dead Black male conveys that the living Black male, be he an adult male or boy, is fundamentally incompatible with all that is naturally beautiful, good, and true in the white world. So this presentation will ask how white European cultures conceptualize the sublime through the murder, lynching, castration, and mutilation of Black males throughout the century. And I say this as giving an example of the Black male as only one particular case where racialized or subjugated male corpses have been and remain a source of aesthetic creativity for colonizing imperial populations. So I'm really moved by the definition of aesthetics that we get by Castronovo. Uh, he writes that when we construe it as a political discourse about form, aesthetics theorizes what art does, the subjects it creates and limits, the analysis it forecloses and enables, and the justice it promises and the injustice it legitimates. Propaganda, above all, represents an aesthetic concern about the form politics should take. Enabling distinctions between art and aesthetics, propaganda does not separate these two densely intertwined categories as much as turn the tables on the relation to imagine different criteria that give primacy to aesthetics. Usually, a second order discourse is a field of investigation devoted to understanding art as one historical form among many forms, legal, national, gendered, that constitute social possibilities and political horizons. Instead of attempting to unlock the meaning of an artwork, aesthetics probes the initial exclusions, effects, and uses of forms. And I want to take a minute here to provoke us to think about um, how Black aesthetics have come about. Traditionally, when we think of Black aesthetics, we think about the creative possibilities that Black people have used to fight against dehumanization. But what this presentation is going to do, what I'm really interested in provoking us to do, is to think about how the violence and horror, the dehumanization that we have traditionally contrasted to positive Black aesthetics. So, Black people as animals, savages, versus Black people as musicians, thinkers, philosophers, and people, to ask ourselves, what is it that the white world saw itself creating in horror? What does the dead Black body represent about colonial forms and epistemology that enables colonizing peoples, such as the white race in Europe and the United States, to view the death, corpse, murder, and mutilated flesh of Black people, but specifically and especially the Black male, as something of beauty? Now, this, of course, requires us to do some legwork in Kant's theory of the sublime. Now, In Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, written in the 1700s, Kant offers his first descriptions of the sublime. He describes the sublime as an effect that moves one's mind and soul, while the attribute of beauty merely charms one's sensibilities. So, what Kant wants to do is suggest that there is a kind of context and overwhelming feeling and sensibility that can't simply be captured by our eyes or by our mind. He explains the sublime in this way. He describes tall oaks and lonely shadows in a sacred grove as sublime, whereas flower beds, low hedges, and trees trimmed in figures are beautiful. For him, the night, this idea of the unknown that doesn't get overwhelmed with what we see in the day, is sublime, whereas the day is beautiful. So for Kant, he describes this kind of overwhelming sense of principles that constrain the senses and modify behavior and draw them into something beyond itself, an idea that draws our references beyond itself as that which is sublime, which is why he understands the danger and violence that one utilizes to protect their own rights, the rights of their country or that of others as sublime, whereas simple crusades and conquests are not. Now, this theory of the sublime, of course, develops more in the third critique. In the third critique, Kant, or the critique of judgment, Kant wants to have a notion of the sublime that is intertwined with beauty but reaches beyond it. In this critique, he specifically is interested in the notion of sublime and beautiful nature and how one is bound versus unbound. So he writes that the beautiful in nature concerns the form of an object, which consists in an object's being bound, but the sublime can also be found in a formless object, insofar as we present unboundedness, either as in the object or because the object prompts us to present it, while yet we add to this unboundedness to the thought of its totality. So Kant concerns himself with the beautiful and sublime in nature and divides the sublime as having two different attributes, one that is mathematical and the other that's dynamical. Now, when Kant's describing the mathematical aspect of the sublime, he's not simply trying to convey the sheer number of objects, but its magnitude by its unity. The example he gives of this is the Milky Way, such that the farther we progress in conceptualizing the Milky Way, the larger are the unities that we reach. Now, the dynamical is something different. For Kant, the dynamical can be best understood as grasping a kind of might, a force of dominance above ourselves that inspires our fear. He explains it as a virtuous person fearing God but not being afraid of him. Now, these two elements of the sublime really do capture how I see white supremacy acting and creating black males as corpses, as objects of beauty within the white mind. Now, Richard Gilmore also gives us a peek at this when he talks about the ways in which that which is terrifying in the sublime can also give us pleasure, what he refers to as negative pleasure. Now, Gilmore suggests that this negative pleasure is an indirect pleasure that comes not from the sublime itself, but from the relief we feel when we realize that this external disorder does not really threaten our internal order. When we recognize an alternative purposiveness identified by reason that's independent of all worldly threats, namely what Kant refers to as our supersensible destination, which is to be good or moral. Now, what's interesting about the way that Gilmore is describing this is that he's suggesting that even in acts that we are terrified of, right, we can find purpose and joy in them. And this is what I think is happening when we view something of horror like the corpse. Now, at the beginning of section 27, Kant writes the feeling of our incapacity to attain to an ideal which is law for us is respect. That is, the confrontation with the unthinkable in the sublime recalls us to our inadequacy and compulsion to make ourselves adequate to the idea of moral law. Hence, the sublime compels us to acknowledge an alternative purpose for us from that purpose which is susceptible to the dangers of the world, namely to be moral. With respect to that purpose, this object poses no threat whatsoever. Hence, we are able to regard the object disinterestedly. The pleasure we get derives from the recognition of our essential safety with respect to the threatening thing. Kant describes the pleasure of the sublime as a kind of joy. The pleasurableness arising from the cessation of an uneasiness is a state of joy for him. Now, to some, we may find this to be strange, but think about the horrors that we all assume, right, come over us when we see dead black male bodies. we assume that there's a kind of horror and grotesqueness in seeing this form, but the world acts quite differently. The world acts as if it's not incompatible with its moral code, with the code of respecting safety, civility, and the good. So in the real world, while Kant gives us the rules and the observations of the feeling of beautiful and sublime, as well as the third critique, in the real world, as he's talking about the pragmatic anthropology, we see the sublime in beautiful things. So if we live in a white supremacist society that sees the corpse or black men as dangerous and the elimination of them as a good, we see beauty in that act. Now, remember, this is not simply in the appearance of the object before us or the corpse before us, but rather this is a quality that belongs to aesthetic judgment. It's about how the representation of the sublime can add and should nevertheless be beautiful in itself, but it's not perceived necessarily to be barbaric or contrary to good taste. This is why in the pragmatic anthropology, which is fundamentally concerned with how people create themselves and a society under the condition of freedom, Kant is describing the sublime as something that inspires awe, that is great, as it's a degree which invites us to approach it, even though we have trepidation and fear. So he's saying that for us seeing something that we think will overwhelm us, if we ourselves are in a safe place, the collecting of our powers to grasp the appearance, along with our anxiety that we're unable to measure up to his greatness, arouses surprise, a pleasant feeling owing to his continual overcoming of pain. So the sublime is the counterweight, but not the opposite of the beautiful, because the effort and attempt to raise ourselves to grasp this ultimate idea, that both in its mathematical and dynamical forms of the object awakens in us a feeling of our own greatness and power. But the representation and thought of the sublime by description or presentation can and must always be beautiful. So this is why I think that we can utilize some of these analytic categories given to us even by Kant as a way for us to think about the male corpse as aesthetic matter for the oppressor. Now, some of these images will be disturbing for people, but it's necessary for us to understand both what happened during the act of lynching and police killings, as well as how the white public perceived and described the bodies of black men that were affected by this. So I want to start with more of a historiographic point here. We often think about the killing of racialized people as an aberration to the forms or the practices of democratic and free societies. In many ways, we actually see that historically, violence against racialized people is quite normalized, not only in the sense that it occurs, but that it actually functions to maintain a kind of civility and social order in the mind of the white oppressor. As I wrote in an article, Thinking Through the Silence, theorizing the rape of Jewish men during the Holocaust, most of the research describes the death and stories of racialized males as conquered men and boys. And it's told by their deaths and written through the scars that are etched upon their corpses. Now, this follows up from a point made by Adam Jones in Gender and Genocide, where he notes that non-combatant men have been and continue to be the most frequent targets of mass killing and genocidal slaughter, as well as a host of lesser atrocities and abuses. So the mass killing of males, particularly of battle-age men, has roots deep in the history of conflict between human communities and remains a frequent and often defining feature of human conflict and perhaps human social organization extending back to antiquity. So, contrary to the ways that we may think about hierarchies of gender or sexuality or being within a metropole, what we find within the colonial and imperial circumstance that gives rise to violence and genocide is that racialized men have been the primary targets of that violence. So, oppressors see a group that they want to eliminate through the elimination, conquering, and conquest over their male participants, even when they're not combatant. Now, historically, throughout the United States, lynching has been a way to control and create certain political wills, aims, or rather lessen the political wills and aims of Black people in that geography. Now, when they started actually studying how lynchings happened, who they affected, and the conditions under which they occurred, we find that for many Black people in America, anytime they stepped out of their place, wanted to vote, chose to pursue freedom, looked at a white woman longer than 2 seconds, these became reasons to end their lives. It became a justification for spectacle violence. Now, the Equal Justice Initiative report that was commissioned by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People documented 4,084 racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1950. Now, Black men comprised roughly 95% of the victims of lynching during this period. And the number of Black women lynched between 1838 to 1969, which is the last official lynching in the document, was estimated to be about 188. So this means that the white public understood lynching to be a mechanism that could be used against all Black people. Some white people were lynched, some Hispanic peoples were lynched, but particularly targeting the bodies of Black men. This is a photograph of the lynching of Henry Smith that occurred February 1st, 1893. Notice the white public. Notice the ways in which this becomes a spectacle, where it exists not outside of society or the order and practices of their given city, but very much as part of it, where the white public was not only supposed to witness, but participate in the ways that Black men were lynched. Depictions of Mr. Smith circulated around local newspapers like the Fort Worth Gazette, showing his body on fire and participants in a large public that wanted to see this. When we think about this kind of violence, we're almost embarrassed by the kind of horror that happens within a allegedly democratic country. But we have to remember that what we take to be the normative values of our society that brings us individuality, security, safety, etc., is built on the back of colonialism, which is fundamentally rooted in enslavement and genocide. The mistake that we often make is assuming that the values of people who are the descendants of a genocidal and colonial population can be such that they're compatible with people who are still very much subjugated within those borders. Said differently, there is no reason to assume that the values of a white American population that are very much descended from white colonizers, lynchers, murderers, rapists, and enslavers can in fact lead to or be comfortable and compatible with the values of liberation that Black Americans are still fighting for. This is why we see a fundamental disconnect between the ways that white Americans describe, protest, and react to the murder of Black men with police killings, to how Black people are still reacting to that as an extension of the lynching technology that's been happening to them for hundreds of years. So we see the same kind of violence with Sam Hose in 1899. The mutilation of Black men's bodies was a signal of progress and a signal of the health of the times. It was the idea that Black men could never be justified in existing politically and economically alongside a superior white race. Now, Mr. Hose was lynched for defending himself against a white attacker when he was covered in the Calhoun Times on April 21st, 1899. The idea here was that there should be a celebration of his death, despite the brutality and the horror that was shown by him being lynched and charred to death. The very last paragraph of this sentence indicates how the civilizational discourse of white supremacy sought to justify itself, was in fact not only justified, but the normative course of justice for Black men to be killed in this way. And when I say the normative force of justice, what I mean here is it's part of the value system. It's part of the way that any civilization that cared about democracy and justice would react if a Negro had committed a crime. As the editorial says, the burning of a human being at the stake is a matter so horrible as to shock any civilized community. But the crime of the Negro was such as to drive all men insane. And while the punishment was as terrible as human ingenuity could invent, the provocation was as great as the Negro could possibly make it. So there is order reestablished by the murder and the mutilation of the Black male that has no real explanation beyond the fact that even in civilized societies, there's the idea of extralegal violence that the Black male has to be subject to maintain order. So James Baldwin talks about this in his work, specifically his short story, Going to Meet the Man. Now, in my previous research, I've explained how white men learn of themselves through the death of the black male. In killing the men of indigenous populations, whites create themselves because they establish their power and they stand in awe of the world that's made possible to them with the elimination of savagery. Now, in Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man, Baldwin describes lynching through the eyes of a white male character he created named Jesse. Now, there's a lot of graphic language and scenes in Baldwin's description, but Jesse has a problem with impotence and sexual arousal. And Baldwin wants to explain both the erotics and the attraction that Jesse has to the sight of dead black men. Baldwin is asking the reader to think through how the violence, the blood, the death, the mutilation that affects the racialized male body is not only experienced as sexual desire and power, but is also something that brings together a white community, reassures them of their power over the Negro. It is, in fact, compatible with civility and democratic order in the South. So Baldwin, through a short story, asked us to not only imagine the beautiful, which is going to be described as you in a moment through how Jesse's talking about the act of lynching, but also how values are created in the death of black men that create unity in society and make individuals want to participate in the larger of that kind of violence at large. So Jesse describes the naked, hairless body of the hanging black male as the black male was about to be castrated as awe-inspiring. In the text, he says he watched his mother's face. Her eyes were very bright. Her mouth was open. She was more beautiful than he had ever seen her and more strange. In the short story, Jesse then says that he thought that the gleaming body of the black man was the most beautiful and terrible object that he had ever seen till then. But he had still wished it had been the man holding the knife and the black man's privates. Now, every time I read or my class reads Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man, there's a fundamental and a visceral feeling of disgust and grotesquerie given the imagery. The idea of black men being castrated, the idea of white men holding a knife and pulling on black men's genitalia, the idea of a white public not only in awe of the spectacle, but wanting to be the people that get to commit the violence. And of course, there's the sexualization of Jesse, the ideas of his sexual excitement and that of his mother. For many of us, we see that as being unimaginable. But if we see beauty as being something located in what the death of the black male represents to a white population trying to maintain and suppress black people, then we can see how the history of white patriarchy, white feminism, violence, and segregation go hand in hand with the power to create a world. Said differently, whereas we have traditionally conceptualized aesthetics as creating notions of the good, the beautiful, and the true that inspire democracy, is there a case through the reading of Baldwin and the understanding of the murder of black men that there is a colonial aesthetics that through what we take to be horrors and the mutilation of black or indigenous bodies creates beauty for the oppressor because it creates a world that white oppressors aspire to. It represents a power they have to control or let live or kill those who are not able to be subjugated to them fully. It's these kinds of ideas that fundamentally drive how Baldwin is trying to think about the relationship between beauty and the black male corpse. So I think that this analysis also applies to how we think of black men in relationship to police killings. So I don't want to take a lot of time with the data, but suffice to say that we see the same kinds of statistical disparities or disproportionate effect and consequence on being black and male and being killed by police as we did with lynchings. Over 96 per 100,000 Black men are killed over their life course compared to 5.4 per 100,000 Black women. As we know, racial disparities are even greater. If we represent this in a chart, we can see this kind of order of magnitude around racialized men compared to white men and all groups of women. This is why I think that it's really important to get a handle around what Adam Jones was discussing and other people like Earl Miller, Jim Sedanis, and myself in terms of how the racialized male body is almost a canvas for the terrors and horrors that are written upon the flesh of racialized people. So, in many ways, the elimination of the black male corpse represents an appeal to safety and civility. Due to anti blackness, white supremacy, and the histories of violence through colonialism, white societies find beauty and order in the death of racialized men. Now, this is not simply symbolic, this also has a demographic function, right? We saw the same things in the 1970s and 80s with the rise of criminal and the myth of the super predator. The idea that killing black men lessens a dissident, radical, and criminological or criminal element in white societies. So, in this way, lawmakers, policymakers, opinion makers, and white racists have found a unity and consensus in the need to control the black male population. This is why in the United States, historically, and even going back a couple of years, we see the deliberate pronouncement of killing black men as a way to increase the safety and stability of America as a democratic society. And this is why the killers of black men, people like Darren Wilson, are actually rewarded for their courage to eliminate the savagery that whites think are threatening democracy and protect white Anglo-Saxon culture and civilization, and of course, protect white women from the black rapists. Now, a major issue here is how we think about the perception of black men and boys. Often, when we talk about the phenomenology of blackness, we appeal to Fanon. We talk about misrecognition as the basis, or the white gaze creating a fictive character. That's very true and very useful for how we may think of the perception of black men and boys in a racist society, be it the United States or various countries throughout Europe. But there's also something here that's important. The ways in which the visibility and recognition of particular racialized male groups negates the possibility of their humanity and robs them of human qualities because of how that group is perceived. So the deficit of being perceived as a racialized male is rooted primarily in non-being and consequently defined by the caricatures of the dominant group. So in this sense, recognition is not only a problem of misrecognition, it is the problem of a categorical imprisonment or being confined to the caricatures of oneself as they appear to the dominant group. That means that they cannot be recognized as human. So, whereas we traditionally think of aesthetics as a debate over what is beautiful or the function that notions of beauty have as propaganda or politics or disruptions of forms or symbols, I'm suggesting that there is a historical and sociological problem here where the function and process of dehumanization renders it such that one cannot be recognized as human because the group that one emanates from is not human. So philosophers often ignore the empirical evidence, which shows that humanity is not merely evaluated by the degree to which it's afforded to bodies, but its more sterling qualities, or its inability to be sullied or diminished by its association with that which is non-human. So, as Harris and Fisk argue in their study looking at neuroimaging and dehumanization, not all prejudices are equal, and members of some social groups seem to be dehumanized, at least as indicated by the absence of typical neural signatures for social cognition. Now, the reason that this study is important is that it's telling us something about the way that we perceive persons and objects in nature or the real world, to use Kant's language. When we perceive the other, the assumption is that if the other differs from the dominant white male or the dominant white female, that all forms of marginalization become the basis of dehumanization. So all forms of difference, all forms of marginalization become equal in the mind of people often taking up the banter of the decolonial work or theory. I'm suggesting that that's incorrect, that oppressor groups define groups of people based on their relative threat or the historical force of subjugation, such that some groups are in fact marginalized and other groups are altogether not human. And that these can be empirically tested because when you look at the minds of the dominant group members, like white Americans, there is no neural activity for Black men, and there is some say for other groups like white women. So, contrary to philosophical debates and even debates in the philosophy of aesthetics based on recognition and misrecognition, there is scientific evidence to show that some groups are simply not perceived as social beings at all within the minds of dehumanizers. Now, what that means then is that there is nothing within the group or the corpse of the Black male that offends the sensibilities of the dominant white group. In fact, what we do know is that despite how Black men actually are, they're more visible to white men and women because their mere presence or even their names trigger fight or flight responses. So a name that's associated with a Black male, like Jerome or Tyrone, triggers survivor instincts in whites to address the perceived formability, the idea that these Black men are bigger, stronger in stature, and more violent than any other male target. So this also has been shown in the attentional focus research, right, of Black men, where there's both conscious and unconscious relegation of Black men to threats. Trollwater has a study in 2008 entitled Intending to the Threat, where the findings suggested in addition to affording stereotype consistent processing on tasks that explicitly tap or prime crime, race, and danger, Black male targets may be privileged for attentional resources, mean when they say privilege for intentional resources, there's more likelihood that they will be focused on, looked at, attended to compared to other objects or subjects in their surrounding, similar to more evolutionarily significant threats and stimulus like snakes, spiders, and angry faces. So for white Americans, then, there is beauty and order found in the death of Black men. And this is where I think the Sublime has something to say about the experience beyond simply killing a Black man and eliminating or moving toward the elimination of a race for the purpose of white supremacy. The death of Black males represent an ever expanding purposeless purpose or a shared aspiration to live in a world where one is able to kill the Black male threat and gaze upon his corpse as evidence of this ever dawning day. Democracy is enhanced, civility is enhanced, safety is enhanced by the representation of the dead Black male. And this is a driving force behind how we think that beauty and order is created in our American society. So when you look at something like this, which is the death of Michael Brown, which occurred August 9th of 2014, his body was laid on the ground, was left on the ground for 4 hours for everyone in the neighborhood to see. And this is important because in the United States, when Black men are killed, their bodies are displayed to the world. They're shown to the world. When you have mass killings of white children, you don't see dead bodies. When you have killings of women, specifically white women, you don't see their dead body. The corpse is not brought out, it's not rolled out to the public to represent something or an act that has been done because those groups of people are human. The Black male is not. There is no shame in killing the Black man and putting him up for the world to see as evidence of the violence that police and white vigilantes have. Even with the corpse of Trayvon Martin, who was killed February 26th of 2012, we see the same thing. When this initially happened in the United States, people had taken this image and made a video game about it. They had apps about that displayed the corpse of Mr. Trayvon Martin, a child. And George Zimmerman became a national celebrity. He got money, he got fame, his gun sold for thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was a more moralization of the artifacts used to bring death to this young Black man. And again, when we have these conversations, we don't speak about the function or role that the Black male corpse signals to the world, the way that it creates community and unity, if we think back to Kant's notion of a civilizational ethos that moves to provide for white life and create Black death. So this is why I argued in The Man Not that the Black male is a shadow of sorts, because he's a transmutable horror that's formed in the mirage of the onlooker's most dreadful thoughts. He becomes a nightmarish creature that we think roams the Western world, where legend asserts that the black male transforms into the worst fears of his onlooker upon their recognition of him. He is actually known as death, rape, and murder to all others but himself, which is why James Baldwin once said that to be an American Negro male is to also be a kind of walking phallic symbol, which means that one pays in one's own personality for the sexual insecurity of others. To be black and male, then, is having one's social genesis, the body one is recognized through, rooted in caricature, and their transfiguration as a phobic entity or a living schiaphobia. So the mutilated black male has been shown to the world as a corpse over the last 200 years. It's presented on the one hand by black Americans as the kind of horror that American racism imposes on black men and boys who dare to step out of their place, right? But at the same time, the creators of these horrors, the white men and women who kill black men, mutilate black men, castrate black men, show the very same images as evidence of white supremacy and the ability of white male power to protect white womanhood, white families, and by extension, the white society from the black male beast. We have very little scholarship that analyzes the white imagination's creations of horrors and appreciation of what we black people and oppressed people think of as terror, as beauty within the white mind. Remember, Emmett Till was a boy. This is a child. But the example that his corpse served to show the power of white supremacy, the power of white men, the power of a white society to be collectively indifferent, but nonetheless adamant that white supremacy is in fact just and the only way to preserve white civilization was unquestioned. It was not about the act of killing the black boy, but rather how the meaning of killing the black man or this black boy that could become a black man, in fact, gave an overwhelming feeling of the magnitude and power of white supremacy. So even in our contemporary logics, our contemporary spaces and conversations, we see national news outlets. This is a photo taken from the National Geographic, where black boys who are alive are still presented to America as a corpse. And the irony here, the irony of this photo shoot, this is the title of it, a special edition in Race of America, is that there was no offense raised by anyone in displaying black boys who are alive as corpses and dead. Because the ultimate issue here was, how does one create empathy with a white population? And throughout the article, the issue was not that young black boys would not grow up to be black men. No, there was no empathy available for how we thought about that, but rather the connection of white liberals with the loss of black mothers. So it's the mourning of the mother. It's her suffering of losing a son that becomes the basis of conversation with a white American population that's almost completely indifferent to the ongoing murder of black men and boys within his borders. So the subject has to switch, because black men exist as an aesthetic object, as a canvas for the terror and the creation of pleasure and beauty for the white public to consume. So the same way the KKK created postcards and demonstrations of lynchings and christenings, et cetera, to unify the society, to give them an idea by which they can aspire to, is the same way that our seemingly progressive resistance to this idea nonetheless normalizes how the white public sees the black male body. So this is why I'll conclude. Ultimately, I think that in the analysis of the beautiful and the sublime, we see that there's an effective reach, a force, a gravitas, a feeling, pulling the white public into these notions of beautifulness, of beauty, of order, a democracy in the death of Black men and boys. So then I have some questions that I think are raised by this claim. The first is, how does the horror of the Black male corpse, in fact, continue legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and anti-Blackness that we find in all colonial and post-colonial spheres? The second is, how does the murder of Black males create an aesthetic value for the oppressor class? Thinking about the news releases, the pictures, the artistry, etc., of how lynchings and police killings are represented. To ask you, is there a philosophy of being or ontology and aesthetics that white Americans and white Europeans utilize to justify their use of lethal violence against racialized men, be they Muslim, be they migrant racialized populations, or Black? And lastly, how then does our larger ideas of civility, democracy, and humanism, right, the traditional values or the values that we traditionally associate with notions of aesthetic pleasure or aesthetic form, in fact depend on murder, violence, and the killing of Black males to sustain the sanctity of security, freedom, and property within a democratic social contract? So I think I'll end there and open it up for any questions. Thank you so much.